The year is 1227. A man lies dying in a tent somewhere on the windswept plains of Central Asia. He is 65 years old, which by the standards of a life spent on horseback, conquering the known world, is ancient. His body is failing, but his mind is still sharp, still calculating, still planning for a future he will never see. His name is Genghis Khan, and he has a problem. He has built the largest land empire in human history, from the Pacific Ocean to the doorstep of Europe, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia. 1 out of every 5 people on Earth now lives under Mongol rule. He has shattered kingdoms that had stood for 1,000 years. He has redrawn the map of the world. But empires are not held together by conquest alone. They fracture. They collapse. They dissolve the moment the conqueror closes his eyes for the last time. Genghis Khan knows this. He has seen it happen to others, and he refuses to let it happen to others, and he refuses to let it happen to his empire. So in the final months of his life, he makes a series of decisions that history would spend the next 8 centuries trying to erase. Decisions about who will hold his empire together after he is gone. Decisions that involve not just his sons, the ones everyone knows about, but his daughters, the ones no one talks about. Because here's what they never taught you. While Genghis Khan's sons were busy fighting each other for the throne, tearing the empire apart in succession wars that would last for decades, his daughters were quietly, methodically, brilliantly holding the entire thing together. They governed territories larger than modern European countries. They commanded armies. They collected taxes from kingdoms that had once been empires themselves. They controlled the Silk Road, the economic artery of the medieval world. They were the secret architecture of the Mongol Empire, and then history erased them so completely that most people today don't even know their names. But here's the twist. The erasure wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, systematic, carried out over centuries by historians who couldn't reconcile what these women did with what women were supposed to be capable of doing. And now, 800 years later, we're finally piecing together what actually happened, using fragments of Persian chronicles that mentioned them in passing, Chinese administrative records that listed them as tax collectors and governors, archaeological evidence from the territories they ruled, court documents that survived because bureaucracies keep better records than warriors. What emerges is a story that changes everything you thought you knew about the Mongol Empire, about power, about women, about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. This is that story, and I promise you, by the end of it, you will never think about history the same way again. Let's start with a question, a simple question that unlocks everything. Where are the women? Think about how the story of the Mongol Empire is usually told. Genghis Khan unites the Mongolian tribes. Genghis Khan conquers China, Persia, Russia, Central Asia. Genghis Khan dies. His sons divide the empire. His grandsons fight over the pieces. The empire eventually fragments into successor states. That's the story. Warriors on horseback. Battles. Bloodshed. Conquest. Men doing what men do in history books, which is everything important while women wait in tents, raise children, and disappear from the narrative entirely. But here's the problem with that story. It doesn't add up. The Mongol Empire at its height controlled territories stretching from Korea to Poland. Maintaining control over that much land, across that many different cultures, speaking that many different languages, practicing that many different religions, required more than just military force. It required administration, governance, diplomacy, intelligence networks, economic management. It required thousands of competent administrators working simultaneously across dozens of territories to keep trade flowing, taxes collected, rebellions suppressed, and communication lines open. And here's what historians keep running into when they dig into the actual administrative records. Women's names, everywhere, collecting tribute in northern China, governing frontier territories between the Mongol heartland and the Islamic world, adjudicating legal disputes in Central Asian trade hubs, commanding garrisons along the Silk Road, not occasionally, not as exceptions, systematically, as a core feature of how the empire actually worked. The Mongol Empire had a secret weapon that historians spent centuries overlooking because it didn't fit the narrative they wanted to tell. That secret weapon was Genghis Khan's daughters. But before we meet them, Before we follow them into their territories and watch them govern empires, we need to understand where they came from. Because the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was not like anywhere else, and Mongol women were not like women anywhere else. The steppe is not a gentle place. It's 3 million square kilometers of rolling grassland where the sky feels close enough to touch and the wind never stops moving. Summers are scorching, winters are brutal enough to kill exposed flesh in minutes. There are no cities, no walls, no permanent structures, just grass and sky and the constant struggle to survive. The people who lived there were nomadic pastoralists. They moved with their herds, following seasonal rhythms across the grasslands, living in felt tents called gurs that could be assembled or dismantled in under an hour. Everything about their material culture was designed for movement. Nothing was built to last because permanence on the steppe was vulnerability, and in this world, women were not decorative, they were essential. Think about what happens when the men ride off to war, which on the steppe happened constantly. Someone has to manage the herds. Someone has to organize the camp movements. Someone has to make economic decisions about when to trade, what to trade, who to trade with. Someone has to maintain relationships with neighboring clans. Someone has to defend the camp if raiders come. That someone was women. A Mongol noblewoman of the 12th century could ride a horse as well as any man. She could shoot a bow well enough to hunt and fight. She managed the household economy, which on the steppe meant managing wealth that could move, herds and goods and trade relationships. She made decisions that determined whether her family prospered or starved. When her husband rode to war, she didn't wait passively for his return. She governed, she commanded, she made military decisions if necessary. She was, in every practical sense, the ruler of everything he left behind. This was not exceptional, this was normal. This was how steppe society worked. Because steppe society had no choice. Survival demanded competence from everyone, regardless of gender. Western historians encountering this for the first time couldn't process it. They wrote about Mongol women with a mixture of fascination and horror. Women who rode horses astride instead of side saddle. Women who appeared in public with their faces uncovered. Women who spoke directly to men who weren't their husbands. Women who drank fermented mare's milk and participated in political discussions and expressed opinions. Barbaric, the Europeans called it. Uncivilized, evidence of Mongol savagery. But here's what those European observers were actually witnessing. A society that had figured out something most of the medieval world refused to acknowledge, that women were capable of the same political, economic and military competence as men, and that empires built on that recognition were stronger than empires built on gender hierarchy. This was the world that shaped Genghis Khan's daughters, a world where female authority was not a theoretical possibility, but a practical necessity. And when Genghis Khan started building his empire, he didn't abandon this tradition, he weaponized it. Born around 1162 as Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan had what you might call a difficult childhood. His father was poisoned when he was 9. His clan abandoned his family to die on the steppe. He was enslaved by rivals. His young wife was kidnapped almost immediately after their marriage. What happened next is the story everyone knows. The rise, the unification of the Mongol tribes, the proclamation as Genghis Khan in 1206, the conquest of everything in sight. But here's the part that gets left out. Throughout all of this, Genghis Khan was surrounded by formidable women. His mother, Holan, who kept her children alive through sheer force of will after their abandonment. His wife, Borte, who was not just a consort but a political and strategic partner. His daughter-in-law, Alakhai Bekhi, who would later be recognized as one of the most brilliant political minds of the 13th century. These women didn't just survive in Genghis Khan's world, they thrived, they shaped it. They influenced his decisions. They governed in his absence. They commanded respect from warriors and administrators alike. And Genghis Khan, unlike most men in positions of absolute power, actually listened to them. This is crucial to understanding what comes next. Because when Genghis Khan looked at his daughters, he didn't see marriage tokens to be traded for alliances. He saw assets, tools, governors in waiting. He had at least 5 daughters whose names survived in the historical record. Alakhai Bekhi, Checheikhen, Alakhai Bekhi, Checheikhen, Alakhai, Tumelun, and others whose names were lost when the chronicles that mentioned them were destroyed or forgotten. And he had a plan for each of them, a plan that would turn out to be one of the most sophisticated governance strategies in medieval history. Here's how it worked. When Genghis Khan conquered or made alliances with neighboring peoples, he would arrange marriages between his daughters and the kings or chiefs of those territories. Standard medieval diplomacy, right? Marry your daughter to a foreign ruler, create a family bond, ensure loyalty. Skip Genghis Khan added a twist that changed everything. When a daughter married a subordinate king, Genghis Khan would arrange for that king to be called away frequently, sent on campaigns, summoned to the Mongol court, dispatched on diplomatic missions that kept him traveling for months or years at a time. And while the husband was gone, the daughter ruled, not as a regent holding power temporarily until her husband returned, as the actual governor of the territory, making administrative decisions, collecting taxes, commanding troops, adjudicating legal disputes, running the entire apparatus of government. And here's the genius of it. The daughter never stopped being a daughter of Genghis Khan. She retained her identity as a member of the Mongol royal family. She kept her own household, her own income, her own staff. She was not absorbed into her husband's family the way wives typically were in medieval societies. She remained always and explicitly a representative of Mongol imperial authority, a living embassy. A governor who happened to be married to the local king. Behind her stood the most powerful military force in the world. Everyone in her territory understood this. Challenge her authority, and you weren't just defying a woman, you were defying Genghis Khan himself. This system had an elegant brutality to it. The local king got to keep his title, his prestige, his ceremonial authority. He could tell himself he was still in charge. But the real power, the actual day-to-day governance, the control over resources and troops and trade routes, that belonged to the daughter. And if the king died, which on the steppe and in the territories constantly ravaged by Mongol campaigns happened frequently, the daughter didn't go home. She stayed. She continued governing. Sometimes she was married to another man from the same royal family, maintaining continuity. Sometimes she just ruled as a widow. The men came and went. The daughters remained. This was not an accident. This was not a side effect of Mongol marriage customs. This was deliberate imperial policy. Genghis Khan had created a system where his daughters functioned as permanent governors of conquered and allied territories, embedded so deeply in local power structures that removing them was nearly impossible. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. And it worked so well that the empire his daughters governed would remain stable for decades after his death, even as his sons tore each other apart fighting for succession. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. We almost lost it entirely, because the same historians who chronicled the Mongol conquests in obsessive detail somehow managed to mention the daughters only in passing, usually just noting that a princess was married to this king or that chief, then moving on to what they considered the real story, which was always about men. Why would chroniclers who recorded the minutiae of military campaigns fail to notice that half the empire was being governed by women? The answer tells us as much about history as it does about the Mongols. Persian historians writing in the Islamic tradition couldn't reconcile female political authority with Islamic gender norms, so when they encountered Mongol women governing territories, they noted it briefly and moved on, treating it as an aberration rather than a system. Chinese chroniclers writing in the Confucian tradition had similar problems. Confucian orthodoxy placed women firmly in the domestic sphere. Female governance was seen as disorder, a violation of natural hierarchy. So Chinese historians mention the daughters when administrative records forced them to, but downplayed their significance. Even Mongol sources, written after the empire had fragmented and patrilineal succession had become the norm, focused on the male lineages because those were the lineages claiming power. The daughters didn't fit into the succession narratives, so they faded from the stories. The erasure wasn't a conspiracy. It was 1,000 small editorial decisions made across centuries by writers who couldn't imagine that what these women did was important enough to record in detail. And so the daughters of Genghis Khan disappeared from history. Their territories were attributed to their husbands. Their administrative accomplishments were credited to male officials. Their military commands were forgotten. Their names were lost. For 800 years, the story of the Mongol Empire was told as a story of fathers and sons, of warriors and conquerors, of men building and men destroying, but that's not what actually happened. What actually happened was far more interesting, and we're about to meet the women who made it happen. Her name was Alakhai Bekhi, and she was the most powerful person most people in 13th century northern China had never heard of. The year is 1216. The Mongol conquest of the Jin dynasty, the Jurchen Empire that controlled northern China, is in full swing. Genghis Khan's armies are systematically dismantling one of the most powerful states in East Asia, burning cities, besieging fortresses, forcing the Jin emperor to flee south in humiliation. But conquest is the easy part. Holding territory, administering it, extracting resources from it, keeping the local population cooperative enough that they don't revolt the moment the army moves on. That's the hard part. That's the part that determines whether you have an empire or just a trail of destruction. And that's where Alakhai comes in. She was married to a man named Jin Kuei, the leader of the Ungud people, a Turkic group living in the region just south of the Gobi Desert. The Unguds occupied territory that was strategically critical. They sat on the border between the Mongolian steppe and the sedentary agricultural civilization of northern China. Control the Onguds, and you controlled the gateway to China itself. Genghis Khan needed the Onguds loyal, so he sent his daughter. Alakhai arrived among the Unguds as a bride, but from the very beginning she was something more. The Chinese administrative records, the dry bureaucratic documents that survived because accountants keep better records than warriors, refer to her not as Jin Kuei's wife, but by her own title, Alakhai Bekhi. The Bekhi designation signaled high spiritual and political status. It meant she was recognized as an authority in her own right. And the records make clear what that authority looked like in practice. She collected taxes, she adjudicated legal disputes. She oversaw the integration of Ongud territory into the Mongol administrative system. She managed the delicate balance between steppe customs and Chinese bureaucratic traditions, between nomadic governance and sedentary agriculture. This was extraordinarily complex work. The Onguds were not purely nomadic. They had settlements, agriculture, trade relationships with Chinese merchants. Governing them required understanding multiple economic systems simultaneously. You couldn't just demand tribute in horses and felt the way you might from a steppe tribe. You had to account for grain harvests, for taxation in silver and silk, for merchant guilds with their own hierarchies and customs. Alakhai mastered it all. When Jin Kuei died, the exact year is lost. But it was sometime in the 1220s. Alakhai didn't pack up and return to the Mongol heartland. She stayed. And here's where the story gets interesting. She was subsequently married to 2 more Ongud men, a practice that was common on the steppe where a politically significant widow might be married to another man within the same kinship group to maintain continuity. But through all of these marriages, through 3 different husbands, the thread of authority running through Alakhai herself never wavered. The men changed. She remained constant. She was the government. They were the ceremonial figureheads. There are accounts, admittedly, fragmentary, filtered through Chinese chronicles, that weren't always sympathetic to Mongol rule, of Alakhai suppressing a rebellion among the Onguds following the death of one of her husbands. A faction within the Ongud nobility apparently saw the succession moment as an opportunity to challenge Mongol authority, to reassert independence, to test whether this woman really had the backing she claimed. Alakhai's response was swift and brutal. She mobilized the Ongud military forces loyal to her, crushed the rebellion, and executed its leaders. The speed and decisiveness of her action sent a clear message. The daughter of Genghis Khan was not a woman to be tested. Behind her stood the entire weight of the Mongol Empire, and she was fully prepared to use it. What makes Alakhai's story so significant is its duration. She governed the Ongud territory for decades, not months, not a few years during a temporary regency. Decades, through multiple husbands, through changes in Mongol leadership after Genghis Khan's death, through succession wars and political upheavals that should have destabilized everything. But the Ongud territory remained stable. Taxes flowed to the Mongol center, trade routes stayed open. The region remained pacified and productive, and the reason was Alakhai. She was still governing in the 1230s, appearing in Yuan dynasty records. Chinese sources created after Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, established Mongol rule over all of China as an administrator of extraordinary competence. The Chinese bureaucrats, who had every cultural reason to dismiss or minimize female authority, nonetheless recorded her accomplishments with grudging respect. Because here's the thing, you can ignore a woman's political authority when it's ceremonial, when it's symbolic, when it doesn't actually affect how things work. But you can't ignore a woman who's collecting your taxes, adjudicating your legal disputes, and commanding the troops that enforce order in your territory. Reality as a way of overwhelming ideology. Alakhai was reality, and a historical record, despite every cultural and literary bias working against her, couldn't erase her entirely. But she wasn't alone, not by a long shot. While Alakhai was holding the southern frontier between Mongolia and China, another daughter was managing the eastern networks, the territories stretching toward Manchuria and the Korean peninsula. Her name was Checheikhen. The sources on Checheikhen are thinner than those for Alakhai, which tells us something important about how historical preservation works. Alakhai governed a territory that became part of the Yuan dynasty's administrative heartland, so Chinese bureaucrats generated extensive records about it. Checheikhen's territory was more peripheral from the Chinese perspective, so fewer records survived. But what we have is tantalizing. Checheikhen was married to Tokcha, a prince of the Oirat people, a powerful tribal confederation in the western Mongolian region. The Oirats had submitted to Genghis Khan during the Great Unification campaigns, and their alliance was crucial not just for the warriors they provided, but for geographic access. The Oirat homeland served as a bridge between the Mongolian heartland and the regions further west and north. But here's what makes Checheikhen's role fascinating. She appears in the sources not just as a wife, but as an intelligence asset. A spy, essentially, though that word doesn't quite capture the sophistication of what she was doing. The daughters sent reports back to the Mongol center, regular communications describing conditions in their territories, the behavior of their husbands, the loyalty of local chiefs, the state of the herds and harvests, movements of potential enemies, trade opportunities, political developments in neighboring regions. This was a sophisticated early warning system. The daughters were embedded in territories across the empire's vast frontier, positioned to see threats developing long before they became critical. They were listening posts, human surveillance networks, intelligence gatherers who could report back with insights no male general riding through on campaign could possibly acquire. Checheikhen's reports, or at least references to them in later documents, reveal a woman with a sharp understanding of regional politics. She tracked factional disputes within the Oirat Confederation. She monitored the movements of tribes further north. She noted changes in grazing patterns that might signal drought or migration. She watched for signs of disloyalty among local chiefs. All of this information flowed back to the Mongol court, where it informed strategic decisions about where to send armies, which alliances to reinforce, which potential threats to eliminate before they grew dangerous. And here's the key insight. Male generals and ambassadors could gather some of this information, but they were always outsiders, always temporary visitors, always viewed with suspicion and careful management by the locals who knew what the visitors wanted to hear. The daughters were different. They lived in these territories permanently. They spoke the local languages. They participated in local ceremonies and festivals. They were married into local royal families. They had access to information that no external observer could ever obtain. They heard the private conversations. They understood the unspoken tensions. They knew who really held power beneath the ceremonial titles. They were the perfect intelligence assets, and Genghis Khan deployed them as such, with cold, brilliant calculation. But intelligence gathering was just one dimension of what Chechen did. Because the Oirat territory, like all the daughter territories, was a critical node in the logistical network that made Mongol military success possible. Think about what Mongol warfare actually required. The Mongol army moved faster than any medieval military force had a right to move. They could cover distances in days that should have taken weeks. They could appear without warning, strike, and vanish before defenders could organize a response, but that speed required support infrastructure. Horses needed to be constantly replaced. A Mongol warrior on campaign might ride through 5 or 6 horses, using them hard and swapping them for fresh mounts. Those horses had to come from somewhere. Food supplies, concentrated nutrients that could be carried easily and stored for months, had to be stockpiled at strategic points. Intelligence about enemy movements had to be gathered and transmitted. Communication between far-flung armies had to be maintained. The daughter territories were the infrastructure that made all of this possible. When Mongol armies moved through or near the Oirat lands, Chechekhen's administration provided fresh horses, food supplies, guides who knew the local terrain, and intelligence about conditions ahead. Her territory was a way station, a supply depot, a communication relay, all rolled into one. Without the daughters performing this logistical function, the Mongol military machine doesn't work. The armies slow down. They lose their strategic advantage. They become vulnerable to the same problems that plagued every other medieval military force. Extended supply lines, communication breakdowns, local resistance that can't be quickly suppressed. The daughters were the hidden architecture of Mongol military dominance, and most histories of the Mongol conquests don't mention them even once. While Alakhai and Checheikhen were holding down the eastern frontiers, the western reaches of the expanding empire presented entirely different challenges. And an entirely different daughter. Altalun was married into the Uyghur kingdom, and this marriage tells us something crucial about how Genghis Khan was thinking about imperial governance. The Uyghurs were not nomadic warriors. They were a civilization. They had cities. They had a sophisticated writing system, a tradition of administration and record-keeping. They had Buddhist monasteries and Manichaean temples. They had a merchant class engaged in long-distance trade across Central Asia. They had, in other words, exactly what the Mongols lacked and desperately needed. When the Uyghurs submitted to Genghis Khan, they didn't do so because they were militarily defeated. They did a cost-benefit analysis and decided that cooperation with the Mongols was preferable to resistance. And what they offered in exchange for their submission was administrative capacity. The Uyghur script was adopted by the Mongols as their primary writing system. Uyghur administrators became some of the most important bureaucrats in the early Mongol Empire, creating the written records, tax systems, and communication networks that allowed an empire spanning a continent to function. This was a delicate situation. The Mongols needed the Uyghurs, but they also needed to ensure the Uyghurs remained subordinate, that they didn't use their administrative expertise to carve out autonomy, that they stayed loyal, even as Mongol armies pushed west into Persia and beyond. Enter Altalun. Her job was different from Alakhai's frontier governance or Checheikhen's intelligence work. Altalun was managing the integration of an existing sophisticated bureaucracy into the Mongol imperial system without destroying the administrative capacity that made it valuable in the first place. This required a completely different skill set, not suppressing rebellions or collecting tribute from nomadic herders, but navigating the politics of a sedentary civilization, understanding the factions within the Uyghur nobility, managing the relationship between Uyghur Buddhist institutions and Mongol shamanistic practices, ensuring that Uyghur merchants remained prosperous enough to generate tax revenue, but dependent enough that they couldn't challenge Mongol authority. The evidence, again fragmentary but consistent, suggests Altalun handled this brilliantly. The Uyghur territories remained stable and productive through the turbulent early decades of Mongol expansion. They continued to supply administrators, scribes, translators, and diplomatic expertise to the empire. The Uyghur merchant networks continued to function, moving goods along the Silk Road, generating wealth that flowed both to local elites and to the Mongol center. This stability wasn't automatic. Managing the interface between nomadic conquerors and sedentary bureaucrats has destroyed empires throughout history. The conquerors don't understand or respect the administrative systems they've inherited. The bureaucrats resent their new overlords and find subtle ways to resist. The whole thing collapses into chaos, but in the Uyghur territories it worked. And the reason it worked was Altalun. She was the bridge. She spoke both languages, literally and metaphorically. She understood steppe culture and sedentary civilization. She could translate Mongol demands into terms the Uyghur administration could implement. She could explain Uyghur needs and constraints to the Mongol court in ways that made sense to people who thought in terms of herds and horses rather than tax rolls and grain stores. And she had authority in both worlds. Among the Uyghurs, she was the representative of Mongol imperial power, backed by the threat of military force. Among the Mongols, she was a daughter of Genghis Khan, a member of the royal family with direct access to the center of power. This dual authority made her indispensable, and it made the Uyghur integration into the Mongol Empire one of the success stories of early Mongol expansion, a case where conquest led not to destruction, but to a functioning hybrid system that benefited both conquerors and conquered. At least, it benefited the elites. Let's not romanticize this. The Uyghur peasants and merchants who paid taxes to support Mongol military campaigns probably had more complicated feelings about the arrangement. But from the perspective of empire building, Altaland's governance was a masterclass in administrative integration, and it established a template that would be replicated across the Mongol Empire as it absorbed more and more sedentary civilizations. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting. Because the three daughters we've discussed so far, Alakhai, Checheikhen, Altalun, they're the ones for whom we have the most evidence. But Genghis Khan had more daughters. At least two more whose names survived, two Melun and others whose names appear only in fragmentary references, or not at all. And every one of them was deployed the same way, married into a strategic territory, given authority to govern, used as an instrument of imperial control. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't Genghis Khan being unusually generous to his daughters or having progressive views about gender equality. This was cold, strategic calculation. The daughters were assets, tools, governors who couldn't rebel because they had no independent power base, no male heirs who might challenge the central authority, no armies that owed loyalty to them personally rather than to the empire. They were utterly dependent on Mongol imperial backing for their authority, which meant they were utterly loyal. They couldn't play the game that male governors and generals constantly played, accumulating power, building personal followings, positioning themselves or their descendants to eventually challenge the throne. The daughters had authority but no succession rights, power but no dynasty. They could govern brilliantly for decades, and it posed zero threat to the imperial succession because their children, if they had any, were not in the line of inheritance. They were, from Genghis Khan's perspective, the perfect governors. Competent, loyal, embedded, and structurally incapable of becoming rivals. It was brilliant, it was ruthless, and it's probably the single most important governance innovation of the early Mongol Empire that nobody talks about. But here's the part that makes this story tragic. Because this system, this brilliant deployment of daughters as governors, died with Genghis Khan's generation. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the succession went to his son Ogedei, and Ogedei, like his brothers, was focused on one thing: male line inheritance, dividing the empire among the sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan, establishing clear patrilineal dynasties that would rule the various khanates into which the empire was fragmenting. In this new system, there was no place for the daughters. They weren't in the male line. They couldn't pass authority to their children in the same way sons could. They were increasingly viewed as relics of their father's idiosyncratic governance style, rather than as a permanent feature of imperial administration. The daughters, who were already governing when Genghis Khan died, continued in their positions for years, even decades in some cases. Alakhai was still administering the Ongud territory well into the 1230s, but they weren't replaced when they died. No new daughters were sent out as governors. The system was allowed to atrophy, and slowly, piece by piece, the daughters disappeared from the story. Their accomplishments were attributed to their husbands or to male Mongol officials. Their names were dropped from chronicles. Their roles were minimized or forgotten. Within a century of Genghis Khan's death, the daughter governors were a historical footnote. Within 2 centuries, they'd been almost completely erased. But before they disappeared, they did something extraordinary. They held together the largest land empire in human history during its most vulnerable period. The period right after the founder's death, when succession wars typically tear everything apart. And they did it, not by fighting, not by commanding great armies in dramatic battles, but by governing, by administering, by collecting taxes and adjudicating disputes and managing trade routes and suppressing rebellions and sending intelligence reports and doing the thousand unglamorous tasks that actually keep an empire functioning. They were the glue, the hidden structure, the secret weapon. And for 800 years, almost nobody knew they existed. There's a document that survived the centuries in a monastery library in what is now Iran. It's written in Persian, compiled by a historian named Rashid al-Din in the early 1400s, roughly a century after the events it describes, and buried in the middle of a lengthy discussion about Mongol military campaigns. There's a single sentence that most historians skip right over. It says, "And the princess collected the tribute that year and sent it to the court." That's it, one sentence. The historian doesn't explain which princess. He doesn't say where she was or what territory she governed. He just notes, as if it's completely unremarkable, that a princess collected tribute and sent it to the imperial center, and then he moves on to describing a battle. This is how the daughters appear in the historical record, in passing, in fragments, in sentences that chroniclers wrote down because they were recording administrative facts, not because they thought female governance was particularly interesting or important. But if you collect enough of these fragments, if you read enough Persian chronicles and Chinese administrative records and Mongol genealogies, the pattern emerges, and that pattern reveals something extraordinary. The daughters weren't just governing their own territories, they were running the Silk Road. The Silk Road wasn't a road, it was a network of trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean, from Korea to Venice, connecting every major civilization in the medieval world. Silk, spices, precious metals, gems, horses, ivory, glassware, porcelain, paper, gunpowder, ideas, religions, technologies, diseases. Everything that moved between East and West moved along these routes, and before the Mongols, the Silk Road was a fragmented mess. You couldn't travel from China to Europe under the protection of a single authority. Every few hundred kilometers, you crossed into a new kingdom, a new political system, a new set of taxes and tariffs and regulations. Bandits operated with impunity in the spaces between kingdoms. Merchants were extorted, caravans were raided. The whole system was inefficient, dangerous, and expensive. The Mongol conquest changed everything. For the first time in history, you could travel from Beijing to Baghdad, from Seoul to the Black Sea, under the protection of a single political authority. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, and it made possible a century of unprecedented commercial and cultural exchange that historians sometimes call medieval globalization. But here's what most histories of the Silk Road leave out. The Pax Mongolica didn't maintain itself. Peace isn't the natural state of a trade route stretching across a continent. Peace requires constant active enforcement. It requires governors who understand that protecting merchants is in their own economic interest. It requires administrators who can balance the competing demands of generating tax revenue and keeping trade flowing. It requires someone on the ground in every critical territory, ensuring that bandits are punished, that local chiefs don't shake down passing caravans, that disputes between merchants are resolved fairly. The daughters did this work, all of it. Look at the map of where the daughters were positioned. Alakhai in the Ongut territory, controlling access routes between Mongolia and northern China. Halt in the Uyghur kingdom, sitting at the heart of the Central Asian trade networks. The other daughters, the ones whose names are fragmentary or lost, positioned along the western and northern routes. Every single one of them was governing a territory that sat on or adjacent to major Silk Road arteries. This was not coincidence. This was deliberate strategic positioning. The daughters collected taxes on trade, tariffs and tolls that generated enormous revenue. Contemporary accounts describe merchant caravans carrying goods worth thousands of silver ingots passing through single checkpoints. The taxes on that trade, even at relatively modest rates, represented wealth on a scale that's hard to comprehend. But the daughters provided something even more valuable than low taxes. They provided security. A merchant caravan traveling through Alakhai's territory was traveling under the protection of the daughter of Genghis Khan. Raiding that caravan wasn't just a crime, it was an act of war against the Mongol Empire. The punishment was swift and brutal. Bandits were hunted down and executed. Local chiefs who failed to prevent raids faced consequences that could include the destruction of their entire clan. The daughters enforced this protection not because they were particularly compassionate toward merchants, but because secure trade routes were the foundation of their economic power. A prosperous, well-traveled trade route generated massive tax revenue. A route plagued by banditry generated nothing. Self-interest and imperial policy aligned perfectly. The daughters had every reason to keep the Silk Road safe, and they had the authority and the military backing to make it happen. Merchants knew this, and they voted with their caravans. Trade through Mongol-controlled territories exploded during the 1300s. Goods that had previously trickled along dangerous routes now flowed in massive quantities. Chinese silk reached European markets in volumes that had been unimaginable a century earlier. Persian carpets traveled east. European silver traveled in all directions. African ivory, Indian spices. The whole medieval world was trading with itself, and the daughters were the customs officers, the security guards, and the tax collectors all rolled into one. One merchant account, recorded by a Venetian trader who traveled the Silk Road in the mid-1300s, describes encountering a Mongol princess who collected a tariff on his goods, then provided him with an armed escort through the next stage of his journey. The merchant notes, almost in passing, that the princess spoke multiple languages and personally adjudicated a dispute between members of his caravan. The merchant doesn't seem to find this particularly remarkable, but think about what he's describing. The woman who governed territory along the Silk Road, who collected taxes, who commanded troops, who served as a judge, who spoke the languages necessary to communicate with merchants from across Eurasia. This was what the daughters did. This was their job. And they did it so effectively that the entire medieval global economy came to depend on them. But economic governance was just one dimension of the daughters' power, because the territories they controlled weren't just trade routes, they were military bases. The Mongol military system was unlike anything the medieval world had seen before. Speed was everything. Mongol armies could move 100 kilometers in a day. They could appear without warning, strike, vanish, reappear somewhere else entirely. But that speed required infrastructure. Horses were the foundation of everything. A Mongol warrior on campaign might need 5 or 6 horses, riding them in rotation to keep them fresh. When a horse was exhausted, you swapped it for a new one, which meant you needed a constant supply of fresh horses positioned along your route of march. The daughter territories provided those horses. They maintained vast herds specifically for military use. When a Mongol army approached, the daughters' administrators would have hundreds or thousands of horses ready for transfer. The army would swap out their exhausted mounts and continue moving at full speed. Without this system, the Mongol military advantage disappears. The armies slow down. They become predictable. They lose the element of surprise that made them nearly unstoppable. The daughters were the logistics officers of the Mongol war machine, and logistics, not battlefield tactics, is what wins wars. But it wasn't just horses. The daughters' territories served as supply depots, storing concentrated fruit supplies that armies could pick up as they passed, dried meat, cheese, grain, everything a mobile army needed to keep moving without stopping to forage. They served as intelligence hubs, collecting information about enemy movements and transmitting it to Mongol commanders. They served as communication relays, ensuring that messages could move quickly between far-flung armies and the imperial center, and in some documented cases, they served as military commands themselves. There are accounts, admittedly filtered through multiple layers of translation and chronicle writing, of daughters leading troops into battle. Not metaphorically, literally riding at the head of cavalry forces, directing military operations, suppressing rebellions. Alakhai's suppression of the Ongud rebellion is the best documented case, but there are fragments suggesting others did the same. A Persian chronicle mentions a princess who led a punitive expedition against a neighboring tribe that had raided merchants under her protection. A Chinese source notes a daughter of the royal family who commanded garrison forces during a border conflict. These accounts are brief. The chroniclers don't dwell on them. Female military command wasn't what interested them, but the accounts exist, and they suggest something important. The daughters weren't just administrators sitting in palaces signing documents. They were martial figures. They rode, they fought, or at least they commanded forces that fought. They understood that governance on the Mongol frontier rested ultimately on the credible threat of force. And they were willing and able to use that force when necessary. This shouldn't surprise us. Remember where these women came from. They grew up on the Mongolian steppe, where women learned to ride and shoot alongside men. They were trained from childhood in the skills necessary for survival in a world where violence was intimate and constant. Sending them out to govern frontier territories and expecting them not to use military force would be like sending a surgeon into an operating room and expecting them not to use a scalpel. It wasn't a moral question, it was a practical one. The daughters had authority because they had the capability to enforce that authority. Everyone in their territories understood this, and the historical record, despite its biases and omissions, preserves enough fragments to prove it. Now, if you've made it this far, if this story has changed the way you think about the Mongol Empire, about power, about the women history forgot, then here on Mementos Historians, we'd love for you to subscribe. Because this is what we do. We uncover the stories that were buried, the histories that were erased, the women who shaped the world and then disappeared from the record. Hit that subscribe button, because the daughters of Genghis Khan are just the beginning. There are more stories like this, more women whose power was real, whose accomplishments were extraordinary, and whose names history tried to forget. Now let's continue, because we're about to get to the part where it all falls apart. Genghis Khan died in 1227. The official accounts say he died from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse during a campaign against the Tangut kingdom. Other accounts suggest illness, some whisper assassination. The truth is lost. But what happened next is crystal clear. The succession was a disaster. Genghis Khan had designated his son Ogedei as his successor, but the transition was far from smooth. The period between Genghis Khan's death and Ogedei's formal election as Great Khan was managed by a regent, Tului's wife Alakhai Bekhi, one of the most brilliant political minds of the century. But even brilliant regency couldn't prevent what came next. The brothers, Genghis Khan's sons, began positioning themselves and their descendants for power. Alliances formed and dissolved. Factions emerged. The empire that Genghis Khan had held together through sheer force of personality and strategic brilliance began to fragment. This is the moment when the daughter system should have proven its value, because while the sons were fighting over succession, the daughters were still governing, still collecting taxes, still maintaining order, still keeping the Silk Road safe, still ensuring that the administrative machinery of empire continued to function. They were the continuity, the stability, the proof that the empire was more than just one man's conquests. But here's what happened instead. The sons and their descendants began consolidating power along patrilineal lines. The empire was dividing into distinct khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan, the Il Khanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Western Steppe. Each of these khanates was ruled by a male-line descendant of Genghis Khan. Each had its own succession system, its own power structure, its own political dynamics, and in this new world, the daughters didn't fit. They weren't in the male line. Their children weren't considered legitimate heirs to imperial authority in the way that sons' children were. They occupied an ambiguous position, honored as daughters of the founder, but structurally excluded from the succession politics that now dominated everything. The daughters who were already in place when Genghis Khan died continued to govern for years, even decades. Their competence was too valuable to discard immediately. The territories they administered were too important to destabilize unnecessarily, but they weren't replaced when they died. No new generation of daughters was sent out as governors. The system was allowed to wither. Alakhai appears in records into the 1230s, still administering the Ongud territory with the same competence she'd shown for 20 years. But when she finally died, sometime in the late 1230s or early 1240s, her territory was absorbed into the Yuan dynasty's standard provincial administration. A male governor was appointed. The special status the territory had enjoyed under Alakhai's governance was eliminated. The same pattern repeated across the empire. One by one, the daughter territories were reintegrated into conventional administrative systems. One by one, the daughters disappeared from the historical record, and with them disappeared the memory of what they'd done. By the end of the 13th century, just 2 generations after Genghis Khan's death, the daughter governor system had been almost completely forgotten. The chroniclers writing the history of the Mongol Empire focused on the male lineages, on the succession struggles, on the great military campaigns. The daughters were mentioned occasionally, usually just in genealogies noting that a certain princess had been married to a certain kin. But their governance, their military commands, their economic management, their decades of administrative competence, all of it was either minimized or erased. This erasure tells us something profound about how history gets written, because the daughters didn't fail. They didn't lose their territories through incompetence or rebellion. They weren't defeated militarily or outmaneuvered politically. They were simply written out of the story because the story the chroniclers wanted to tell was a story about fathers and sons, about patrilineal succession, about male conquest and male governance. The daughters didn't fit that narrative, so they were removed from it. In the British Library in London, there's a manuscript that most visitors walk right past. It's not particularly beautiful. It's not illuminated with gold leaf like some of the medieval texts nearby. It's just a worn, brown, slightly damaged book written in Persian sometime in the early 1400s. But buried on page 372 of this unremarkable manuscript, there's a passage that changes everything we thought we knew about the Mongol Empire. It describes a meeting that took place in 1238, 11 years after Genghis Khan's death. The Mongol Empire is fragmenting. His sons are fighting over succession. His grandsons are positioning themselves for power. The whole thing is on the verge of collapse. And according to this manuscript, a group of Mongol princesses, daughters who had been governing frontier territories, came together in a council. They met somewhere in the Western territories. The exact location isn't specified, and they discussed what to do. The empire their father had built was falling apart. The sons were destroying it with their power struggles. The administrative systems that had kept everything functioning were breaking down. Trade routes were becoming dangerous again. Local rebellions were abucking. The whole magnificent structure was crumbling, and the daughters, according to this account, proposed a solution. They would continue governing their territories regardless of which son or grandson claimed overall authority. They would maintain the tax systems, protect the trade routes, enforce the peace, keep the administrative machinery running. They would be the continuity while the men fought over titles. The manuscript says the proposal was rejected. The male heirs saw the daughters' continued autonomous authority as a threat, as a challenge to their legitimacy, as a reminder that their father had built something that didn't depend entirely on male line succession. So the daughters were gradually, systematically sidelined. Their territories were absorbed. Their authority was transferred to male officials. Their system was dismantled piece by piece. And then, in one of history's most effective acts of erasure, the very fact that they had governed at all was written out of the story. For 7 centuries, this manuscript sat unread. Historians studying the Mongol Empire had no idea it existed. And even when it was finally catalogued and translated in the early 2000s, most scholars treated the passage as apocryphal, as legend, as the kind of colorful story that chroniclers sometimes insert to make their narratives more interesting. But here's the thing. The more scholars dig into Chinese administrative records, Persian court documents, and archaeological evidence from the territories the daughters governed, the more that apocryphal story looks like documented fact. The daughters did try to maintain their system. They did resist absorption into conventional male-dominated power structures. They did fight, not with armies, but with administrative competence to preserve their authority. And they lost, not because they weren't capable, but because history, the way history gets recorded and remembered and told, wasn't interested in their story. But we're interested. And we're about to talk about what happened when the world forgot them. The erasure of the daughters from Mongol history wasn't a single event. It was a process that unfolded over centuries, in multiple languages across multiple chronicle traditions, each with its own reasons for minimizing or ignoring female political authority. Start with the Persian historians. Juvaini, Rashid al-Din, the chroniclers who wrote the most detailed accounts of the Mongol conquests in the 13 and 1400s. These men were products of Islamic literary traditions shaped by centuries of Islamic legal scholarship about the proper roles of men and women. Islamic law, as interpreted in the medieval period, placed women firmly within the domestic sphere. Female governance was viewed as fitna, disorder, a disruption of natural hierarchy. There were exceptions. Female rulers who were acknowledged and sometimes even praised, but they were always framed as exceptions, as temporary deviations from the proper order of things. When Persian chroniclers encountered Mongol women governing territories, they noted it because they were recording administrative facts. A princess collected tribute. A princess adjudicated a dispute. These were events that happened, documented in the records the chroniclers were consulting. But they didn't dwell on it. They didn't analyze it. They didn't recognize it as a system, as a deliberate governance strategy. They treated it as an oddity of Mongol culture, another example of Mongol barbarism, the way these steppe people did things wrong. And then they moved on to what they considered the real story, the military campaigns, the succession struggles, the rise and fall of dynasties. The things men did. The Chinese sources present a different but equally effective form of erasure. Confucian orthodoxy, which dominated Chinese historiography, had very clear ideas about gender hierarchy. Women governed the inner sphere, the household. Men governed the inner sphere, the state. Female political authority was a sign of disorder, evidence that something had gone wrong with the natural order. When Chinese bureaucrats encountered Alakhai administering the Ungud territory, they recorded it because Chinese bureaucracy ran on documentation. Everything was written down. Tax receipts, administrative appointments, legal decisions. The machinery of government generated paper, and paper survived. But the Chinese historians who later used those bureaucratic records to write the official histories of the Yuan dynasty framed female governance as an unfortunate necessity, brought on by Mongol barbarism. The civilized Chinese way was male authority. The Mongols, being barbarians, allowed women inappropriate power. This was evidence of their lack of culture, their distance from civilization. The accounts exist, but they're buried in administrative minutiae, stripped of significance, presented as aberrations rather than as features of a deliberate system. Even the Mongol sources contributed to the erasure. The secret history of the Mongols, the extraordinary epic poem that preserves much of what we know about Genghis Khan's rise, focuses almost entirely on the male lineage. It traces Genghis Khan's ancestors. It describes his unification of the tribes. It chronicles his sons and their rivalries. The daughters appear briefly. They're mentioned in genealogies. A few get named, but their stories aren't told in any detail because the secret history was written to establish the legitimacy of the male line, to prove that the current rulers descended from Genghis Khan through an unbroken patrilineal succession. The daughters didn't serve that narrative purpose, so they were minimized. By the time European historians began seriously studying Mongol history in the 19th and 20th centuries, they were working from sources that had already filtered the daughters out. They read the Persian chronicles that barely mentioned female governance. They read the Chinese histories that treated it as an aberration. They read the Mongol genealogies that focused on sons, and they constructed a history of the Mongol Empire in which women were almost entirely absent. Genghis Khan appears as a lone male genius who conquered the world. His sons appear as squabbling heirs who divided the empire. His generals appear as brilliant military commanders. His administrators appear as faceless bureaucrats implementing policy. The daughters, invisible. This is how history disappears. Not through book burnings or destroyed documents, though that happens too, but through 1,000 editorial decisions. A chronicler decides that a military campaign is more important than administrative competence. A historian decides that succession politics is more interesting than economic governance. A textbook author decides that students need to learn about battles, not about tax collection. Each decision seems reasonable in isolation, but cumulatively they erase entire categories of historical actors, entire systems of governance, entire dimensions of how power actually worked. And what we're left with is a story that's not wrong, exactly, but desperately, catastrophically incomplete. The reassessment began slowly. In the late 20th century, a few scholars started asking uncomfortable questions. Where are the women? How did the Mongol Empire actually administer its vast territories? What do the administrative records say if you read them carefully instead of skimming for military highlights? Scholars like Maurice Rasabi, whose work on Mongol China revealed women in positions of significant political authority, and Broadbridge, whose research on women in the Mongol and post-Mongol Islamic world demonstrated that female governance was far more common than previous historians had acknowledged. Scholars working in Chinese archives, discovering that the administrative records preserved details about female officials that the official histories had minimized or ignored. The breakthrough came from a methodological shift. Instead of reading chronicles for the story they wanted to tell, scholars started reading them for what they accidentally revealed: the passing references, the administrative details, the moments when a chronicler mentioned something in one sentence and moved on without recognizing its significance. Aggregate those moments, compare them across sources in different languages, cross-reference them with archaeological evidence, with administrative records, with genealogies and court documents, and a picture starts to emerge. The daughters were there. They were governing. They were collecting taxes and commanding troops and maintaining trade routes and suppressing rebellions and sending intelligence reports and doing all the unglamorous work that actually keeps an empire functioning. They weren't exceptional, they were systematic. They were systematic, they were policy. And the only reason we didn't know this for 800 years is that every chronicle tradition, for its own cultural reasons, decided not to pay attention. The evidence was hiding in plain sight the entire time. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from archaeology. Excavations along the Silk Road in Central Asia have uncovered administrative centers from the Mongol period, and the artifacts tell a story that the chronicles missed. Standardized weights and measures, evidence of systematic trade regulation. Seal impressions, the kind used by officials to authenticate documents and authorize transactions. Some of these seals bear inscriptions identifying them as belonging to princesses, to daughters of Genghis Khan or his immediate successors. Storage facilities suggesting organized provisioning systems, exactly the kind of infrastructure you'd need to supply passing armies and merchant caravans. Legal documents, contracts and court decisions, some of them bearing signatures or seals associated with female officials. This isn't literary evidence that can be dismissed as exaggeration or legend. This is material culture, physical objects that survived because people used them for everyday administrative work. And they prove that women were embedded in the administrative machinery of the Mongol Empire at every level. The comparison with other nomadic cultures is illuminating. The Scythians, an earlier steppe people, had women buried in warrior graves with weapons and horse gear. The Huns, who terrorized Europe in the 5th century, had female leaders whose authority was documented by Roman chroniclers who encountered them. The Turks, another steppe confederation, had traditions of female authority that persisted into the Ottoman period. The Mongol case isn't an anomaly. It's part of a pattern. Nomadic societies, because of the practical demands of nomadic life, developed more flexible gender systems than sedentary agricultural civilizations. Women in nomadic cultures had authority, had autonomy, had power. But when nomadic empires conquered sedentary civilizations, when they started interacting with chronicle traditions rooted in agricultural societies with rigid gender hierarchies, that flexibility got erased from the record. The daughters of Genghis Khan are the most dramatic example of this pattern, but they're not the only one. Across Eurasian history, steppe women exercised authority, and across Eurasian history, chroniclers from sedentary civilizations minimized or erased that authority because it didn't fit their worldview. Recovering these stories requires reading against the grain, looking for what the sources accidentally reveal rather than what they intentionally emphasize. And when you do that, when you read carefully and critically, the daughters return. Slowly, incompletely, but they return. So what's the legacy? What did the daughters actually accomplish? And what traces of their work survived into the present? Start with the obvious. They held together the Mongol Empire during its most vulnerable period, the decades after Genghis Khan's death, when succession struggles should have torn everything apart. The territories the daughters governed remained stable. They continued generating tax revenue. They continued protecting trade routes. They continued providing logistical support for military campaigns. The Mongol Empire survived long enough to establish the successor khanates that would shape Eurasian history for centuries: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia. These states existed because the empire didn't collapse immediately after the founder's death, and the empire didn't collapse because the daughters were governing. That's not a small thing, that's world historical significance. The Silk Road trade networks that the daughters protected and facilitated contributed to what historians call medieval globalization. Technologies moved along those routes. Gunpowder from China reached Europe, papermaking spread west, mathematical concepts traveled east. Agricultural techniques were exchanged, medical knowledge circulated. The Renaissance in Europe was fueled in part by access to goods, technologies and ideas that traveled the Silk Road. The Islamic Golden Age's scientific achievements spread partly through Mongol-protected trade routes. Chinese economic development in the Yuan period was shaped by access to Central Asian and Persian markets. The daughters were the customs officers and security guards of this system. They made it work. The wealth, the knowledge, the cultural exchange that defined the late medieval period flowed through territories they governed. But beyond the material legacy, there's something else. Something harder to quantify, but equally important. The daughters proved that female political capacity, the ability to govern, to administer, to command, was not invented in the modern period. It wasn't a product of 20th century feminism or 19th century suffrage movements or Enlightenment philosophy. It existed, fully formed, highly effective. In a warrior empire in the 13th century, women governed territories larger than modern European countries. They commanded armies. They managed complex economic systems. They navigated between different cultures and languages. They exercised judicial authority. They suppressed rebellions. They protected merchants. They sent intelligence reports. They made the decisions that kept an empire functioning. And they did all of this not as exceptions, not as rare anomalies that required special explanation, but as a matter of deliberate policy. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan deployed female governors systematically because female governors worked. This challenges some of our most basic assumptions about pre-modern societies, about the inevitability of patriarchal power structures, about what was and wasn't possible before modernity. The daughters existed. What they did was real. The erasure tells us about historiography, not about history. Let's end where we began, with names. Alakhai Bekhi, a woman who governed the Ongud territory for decades, who navigated the border between steppe culture and Chinese civilization, who suppressed a rebellion and maintained order through political upheaval, who collected taxes and adjudicated disputes and sent reports to the imperial center, who was, in every meaningful sense, a governor, a military commander, an imperial administrator, the daughter of Genghis Khan, Checheikhen, a woman embedded in the Eastern Alliance networks who served as an intelligence asset, who reported on political conditions in her territory, who provided logistical support for Mongol campaigns, who maintained order along critical trade routes, who was a node in the communication network that allowed the Mongol Empire to coordinate across vast distances. Altalan, a woman who managed the delicate integration of Uyghur administrative sophistication into the Mongol system, who protected Central Asian trade networks, who bridged the gap between nomadic and sedentary cultures, who ensured that the Pax Mongolica was an economic reality, not just a military one. Tumalyun, a woman whose story is fragmentary, whose details are lost but whose existence is documented, who governed, who mattered, whose erasure tells us as much about how history gets written as her governance tells us about how empires function. And the others, the daughters whose names are lost, whose territories have been forgotten, whose marriages created alliances that history no longer remembers. They were real, they governed, they mattered. And then history swallowed them. But history can be corrected, is being corrected, slowly, imperfectly, with all the limitations that come from working with fragmentary evidence and biased sources, but corrected nonetheless. The scholars working on this now are giving us back something that was stolen, the truth of who built the medieval world, the complete picture of how the largest land empire in human history actually functioned. The Mongol Empire wasn't held together by warriors alone. It was held together by a hybrid system, male generals providing military force, female governors providing administrative continuity, sons on horseback conquering new territories, daughters in administrative centers making those conquests permanent. It was brilliant. It worked. And then it was forgotten. But not anymore. The daughters of Genghis Khan are returning from historical oblivion. Their names are being spoken again. Their accomplishments are being recognized. Their governance is being studied and analyzed and understood. They're not a footnote, not an interesting historical curiosity. They're a central chapter in the story of how the medieval world actually worked. A chapter that was torn out of the book and hidden for 8 centuries. We're putting it back, page by page, name by name, story by story. This is why history matters. Not because it's old, not because it's interesting, but because it's still happening. The fight over who gets remembered and who gets forgotten is ongoing. The daughters of Genghis Khan were almost lost entirely. Almost, but almost isn't the same as completely. Say their names: Alakhai, Checheikhen, Altalun, Tumalun. The daughters of Genghis Khan who governed empires while history looked the other way. Remember what they built. Remember what was taken from them. Remember that power has always been more complicated, more diverse, more fully human than the simple stories suggest. The past is bigger than we were told. The women who shaped it are more numerous and more powerful than the chronicles admitted. And every time we uncover a story like this one, every time we recover a name that was almost lost, we're not just learning history. We're rewriting it, making it more complete, more true, more honest about who actually held power and how they used it. The daughters ruled an empire. Then history erased them. Now we're bringing them back. And if this story changed the way you see the Mongol Empire, the way you see power, the way you see the women history tried to forget, then do something about it. Subscribe, share this video, tell someone who needs to hear it, because the daughters of Genghis Khan are just the beginning. There are more stories like this. More women who governed and commanded and built and were systematically erased. More chapters that were torn out and hidden, and we're finding them. One by one, piece by piece, name by name. The daughters of Genghis Khan weren't a secret because they tried to hide. They were a secret because history decided not to look. But we're looking now, and what we're finding changes everything. The largest land empire in human history was not held together by sons alone. It was held together in absolutely critical ways by daughters. Women who rode across the steppe, who commanded from administrative centers, who protected the routes along which the medieval world conducted its business. They were the secret architecture of Mongol power. And now, finally, 800 years later, their secret is out. Remember them.